We appreciate it. May I kindly request for those who are still upstanding to kindly please take their seats. Thank you very much. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we're moving on to the final panel discussion for today. And I'd love to give you a bit of the context before we get into the session. May I also call on your kind attention, please? I appreciate it. May I call on your attention, please? May I also request those who are upstanding to kindly please take their seats? Remember that from this point of view, I can see all of you, including those who are still standing. Thank you very much. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to set the context for the conversation that we're about to have. I'm going to invite my panelists to come and join me on stage. As you can see, it is quite a number of people that will be on stage. And so I'm going to stand this time around so that I can really look them in the eyes as we have this conversation. So here's the context. Over the last 2 days, we have been having a conversation that's allowed us to take stock of the right to social protection as a reality for all. We've moved the conversation somewhat. We've moved on from social protection to begin to talk about an investment paradigm. And we've begun to show that despite the fact that there's been unprecedented consensus on the importance of social protection, that social protection as a human right is still a reality that is a reality for far too few people around the world. We've spoken about innovative solutions to extend social protection, but we've come to the realization that if we're going to reach our goals within the next decade, we actually just cannot continue at the same pace, and we need to accelerate considerably. We've been frank and upright about the fact that we need to close a financing gap. In the last session, we even did some arithmetic to begin to think about where might we find the funds to close that gap. This session that we're about to have now is bringing together governments, social partners, the G20, the UN, and international financial institutions, as well as leading human rights and public finance experts, for them to begin to exchange their views on the different options that countries have to close this financing gap. And when we're talking about options, we're having a conversation that is deeply rooted in the practical. And we're going to be having a practical conversation that seeks to see what can be done at a national and at a global level. I'm going to invite the chair of this session representing the ILO, the Deputy Director General for the Social Protection Department, Madame Valérie Schmitt, to please come up. Let's give her a round of applause as she comes up. Thank you, Valérie. Valérie, ladies and gentlemen, is joined on stage by His Excellency, the Vice Minister of the Ministry of Human Resources and Social Security from China. That is Vice Minister Yu Jun. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Madame Anousheh Karvar, representing the G7, G20 Sherpa, in particular Labour and Employment of France, and representing the G7 Presidency today. Thank you very much, Madame. Yes, right next to Valérie. Thank you. I'm going to be okay. Yeah. Yeah, you're sitting in front of your name, so that's perfect. That's absolutely fine. Thank you very much. Mr. Joachim Breuer, Professor, President of the International Social Security Association. Professor, thank you for being here with us. Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you very much. Madame Magdalena Sepúlveda is here with us today. She's an Executive Director for the Global Initiative for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Madame, thank you for being here. Let's give her a round of applause. Madame Liina Carr, thank you for being here. Madame is the Confederal Secretary of the European Trade Union Confederation. Let's give her a round of applause. We will also hear from Madame Jennifer Topping in this conversation, and she's going to be joining us through a video that we will show as she gives responses to the questions that we have posed to her. But joining us in person as well is Mr. David Coady. He's the Division Chief looking after expenditure policy at the International Monetary Fund. Thank you, Mr. Coady. And thank you very much. Also very forward-thinking and agile. And also Mr. Barry Herman. Mr. Herman is a visiting scholar with the Julien J. Studley Graduate Program in International Affairs at the New School. Thank you very much, sir, for being here. I feel that I'll have better line of sight of being able to look you all in the eyes from this position here, so I'll come down here. And I'd love to start off with a question to His Excellency, the Vice Minister. Your Excellency, if we look at China, we know that the Chinese experience shows that universality can be achieved by combining contributory schemes and non-contributory pensions. In less than 15 years, China has nearly achieved universal social protection for health and old age pensions. How was this achieved? How was this major milestone and breakthrough achieved?
Thank you. Thank you, moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning to you all. It's a great honor for me to be in this high-level segment. And I'm more than pleased to share with you China's experience in social protection. As you may know, Chinese government has always centered the development on people's needs, and it considers the well-being of its people and the social justice as the guiding principle and the ultimate objective of this work to build a comprehensive social protection system covering urban and rural areas. This system comprises two subsystems. One is for employees, a pretty much traditional system, which is financed by employers, employees, and government, providing a relatively high level of protection. The other one is a Chinese innovation, if I may call it. It's for non-employed population, financed by individual participation and government subsidies. Its financing models comes with a different benefit level, and so it may suit different populations. With two different financial models, with two different levels of benefits, all populations are covered by social protection system. And this system also can be connected. We realize the question of justice lies at first in the provision or not of a protection system. So we work to shape the universal participation by using big data, field visits to identify potential beneficiaries to provide better services. At present, we have a system designed to achieve a universal coverage. In 2018, our basic old age insurance covers more than 950 million people, more than 90% of the legal beneficiaries. Our medical insurance has almost achieved the universal coverage. Unemployment and work-related injury insurance cover more than 200 million people. So we are approaching the universal coverage. Of course, this system and this the level of protection it provides should be in conformity with our economic growth stage. And also targeting the population living in poverty, we have also provided a floor. And their old age insurance and their medical insurance, if they cannot pay for it, the government will pay the contribution for them. all the people living in poverty are covered by these two systems. And 90% of their medical expenses are reimbursed. So these people living in poverty will no more be trapped in the poverty because of their disease. That is how we provide a floor for our population, especially population living in poverty. That is also by this action that we contribute to the achievement of SDGs. And we are working hard to providing protection for them.
Thank you very much. And I guess if I were to lift two things that you've said that are critical, you've spoken about will and making choices that could be difficult choices, but exercising that will. But you've also spoken about justice. And if justice is at the core of the why, we begin to see the successes that you share with us today. Let me come to you, Professor Breuer, in your capacity as president of the International Social Security Association. Could you share with us the current contribution of social security institutions that are members of the ISSA in financing social protection? And could you also let us know what you think, whether you think this contribution can be and should be extended in the future?
I could start answering, like usually, by mentioning the example of China, but that has been done by the Vice Minister very well. And it's not only China that is looking for contributory systems in social security. The vast majority of all social security systems on the globe are financed by contributions. And why is that the case? There are several reasons for that. It's not the time to explain that when we talk about adequacy, when we talk about governance in that area, when we talk about labor market incentives, then the contributory systems have huge advantages. But there's one key argument and one key factor, and that has to do with the situation when it comes to a crisis, what happens to every economy in some times. And when we are in situations where a state or a government is in a financial crisis, then it is obliged to do cost cutting. And cost cutting is taking place, even that it is a wrong method, also in that time in social security areas. And the contributory systems are much more stable in that way. And that has to do with the legal situation, with the political situation. And it is not to forget also key for domestic investments. There were only two arguments usually against the contribution to social security systems. One thing was, yes, but you are not able to extend the coverage to the informal sector. Yeah. But the opposite is truth. If you look to that, what you need to cover the informal sector, what do you need? You need identification of the people. You need communication. You need special tools to get in touch with them. And who is able to do that? This is at least only the social security systems in the respective countries. So without social security, you cannot get the coverage for the informal sectors. And there are dozens, no, there are hundreds of examples for it, what you can see on the internet site by ISA, where we are collecting really the practical examples on the globe. A new argument, the last one, against contributory system were, yeah, but you are not able to handle the challenges of the new digital economy of that, let me say, different kind of informal sector. And again, the opposite is the truth. If you look to the examples that are going on in Malaysia, in Uruguay, in Indonesia, and I could mention also a lot of other countries, then it is the contributory system in social security that is able to cover also the new forms of work, and much better and much more stable than other, that means tax finance systems.
So what you've done beautifully is you've taken on some of the debates, debunked certain myths, but also indicated in the process the resilience and the stability that can be derived from contributory systems. I want to build on this line of thought that you have given to us, and I want to come to Madame Carr with this line of thought. Madame, if we think about the current context, where non-standard forms of employment are becoming more and more widespread, and where some institutions are promoting social protection mechanisms that are decoupled from employment, whether it be tax benefit schemes and individual accounts. What are the views of the European Trade Union Confederation on the most optimal way to finance the extension of social security?
Thank you very much for the question. And let's first make clear that I'm speaking on behalf of the European Trade Union movement. So I'm firmly fixed in Europe. We have to bear in mind that in Europe, the social model exists and has been in existence for tens of years. So from the very first and simple short reply to your question is that we, contrary to your advocacy of a contribution-based system, we say that the floor has to be provided by tax-based systems. And yes, we know we've been through the austerity. There are lots of problems. There have been lots of cuts due to austerity. But also the cuts, when we make the cuts, these are political choices where we make the cuts. So, and then in addition to these political choices, we add the changes that are happening in the labor market.
Yeah.
We have platform workers, we have Uberized workers, so these non-standard forms of employment. We have also increased number of self-employed workers in Europe. And in some of the member states, actually, when we look at the contribution-based systems, the difference between an employed person and a self-employed person can be as much as 30%.
Sure.
For the employer or the person using the service. So there is also a kind of negative pressure of trying to push people out from the regular employment because it would be cheaper for a company, for an employer, to use the self-employed person who would have to take the responsibility of making sure that they would have social protection on themselves. But yet again, coming back to the fact that I'm talking about Europe, we believe very firmly that this is wrong, that we need to get back to the situation where the share of income in society will start growing again, because we've seen it reduced for a number of years now, which means also that when we are talking about increased employment, and all the statistics and data shows that in Europe the employment is highest since the pre-crisis times, but when we look at the hours worked, then we are not there yet. We are not back to pre-crisis level, which means that the quality of employment is not there. And in order to be able to finance tax-based systems, we need the quality employment with decent wage, because then also the contributions are there. In terms of having the contributions, having the proper social protection system, that will actually support the economic growth. It doesn't hinder it, it actually supports it. Because we've just heard Christine Lagarde's very first speech as the president of the European Central Bank, and she was actually calling for public investment, increasing the internal demand inside the European Union. Because we can't rely only on trade and external. We need to have strong internal economy inside the European Union. And if the economy is strong, we can also support and have the tax-based systems.
Thank you for that contribution, and I can see that there is a desire to respond and to debate some of the ideas that you've put on the table, but thankfully I'm running the show today, so we're going to keep it moving. But I think back to what we were saying yesterday, and which I think is so important, is to embody a culture of being able to differ, and it be okay for us to differ, because that's what creates good conversation. So thank you for raising those perspectives as well. And what I also appreciate is that we're having a conversation about real challenges that exist as well. So I want to build on this idea of challenges, and I want to just quickly for a moment go back to the Vice Minister and ask you, Your Excellency, to just briefly share one challenge that China currently faces with regards to the social protection system, and in particular, how might you begin to address this challenge?
谢谢。这个
Thank you. Last month, ISSA renewed the 10 challenges faced by global social protection, very similar to those confronted by China today. There are many challenges, for example, aging population. Now in China, more than 240 million people are more than 60 years old, representing 18% of our population. But I today would mention another challenge, which is brought by digital economy. Digital economy is a global trend. It is also true in China. We realize digital economy drives the China's employment sector. More than 76 million people works in the sector of digital economy. In China, though the digital economy bring many changes in our sector of labor, because before the relationship between employees and employers were more traditional. Now with the internet economy, platform economy, new employment forms appear with their flexibility, variety, mobility, and they have impacts on institutions, on labor relationships. Our old social protection system was based on this old traditional employee-employers relationship. So that is the challenge. From the other side, blockchain, AI, biometrics offer new opportunities to provide social protection services. And then e-commerce and mobile payment are reshaping our lifestyle. People are used to use this kind of e-commerce tools. And so they gave birth to varied needs of our users, of consumers. So they also bring the need of transformation to our social protection service model. So from our policy side, the point of view, from the practice point of view, we are facing these challenges. And we are exploring how to innovate our policies, and how to eliminate the barriers brought by our old system. So we are exploring for platform in economy, employers in platform economy, how to establish a targeted protection system for them, especially a work-related major injuries protection system. And in China, injury will employers will be mainly held responsible for injury. So in this new form of platform economy, who will be held responsible and how to deal with it? Then with ICT, how we can push to digitalize the service process, how to increase the use of internet and big data, how to share the relative data, how to transmit the data. We are a large country covering a huge, large geographic areas. So if some people with living in a very far area comes to visit one doctor in Beijing, how can we get his medical report available? How can we make this process easier, and how to improve the efficiency of service? I would like to mention that our policies or our management, we are innovating, and we are also learning from other countries. We like to collaborate more with other countries, with ISA, with ILO, to explore, to innovate, and in order to adapt to the new needs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice Minister. And I think, again, the frankness with which you speak about this challenge is indicative of what we've been speaking about since yesterday, and that's the adaptability of social protection systems. And the fact that the digital economy or the platform economy is a reality in China as it is in many other parts of the world. But you've landed on a point of collaboration, and you've spoken about ISA and others as a potential collaboration. So I'm just going to take that opportunity to jump very quickly back to Mr. Breuer, and just to speak about good governance when it comes to social security institutions. Could you share with us one or two examples of how good governance can actually contribute to achieving SDG 1.3?
I could try to put it into one sentence, but I will do more. And one sentence would be, without a good governance, every good law and every good policy is an empty balloon or is a bubble. Because you can plan wonderful things, if you're not implemented into reality, then it doesn't help the people. And that means governance is the key factor for really adequate social security, not only the law. And that is why ISA is looking all the time for that what we call a dynamic social security, because governance is not only a fixed status where you are here and now for the next 10 years. It is something that is very flexible, needs to be adjusted to the different cultures and areas. Yep. And I think we can show very quickly just 2 out of 100 of examples there, how it's going to happen in the different areas. One could be taken from Africa. If you look to Kenya, for example, what they have done, there was the first member of ISA, that means the National Hospital Fund and the National Social Security Fund, that said, yes, we are able and offer that to the members to pay the contributions by SMS, by text messages. So not to go the long way by bus and train and ever to go to a bank and pay that. No, it is really everything online, even the payment of the contribution and even the services that they offer, and that they're doing together with a provider. And you need to realize in that country, other than in Europe, they have really a ubiquity of the net, so the net is available all everywhere, not like in Germany or other European countries. Second example for doing that, coming to Europe in that way, if you look to Malta, and I take that example briefly also to come a little bit to our conversation or discussion here. There you see that between the state finance system and social security, there must not be a contradiction or really a competition. Yeah. It is a question where you are doing what. What they have done to get those people who that we call difficult to cover, and also women belong to that, to get back on the labor market is a 3-pillar system. So a good governance in the existing law, that they offer special family child care, that they offer special benefits for the spouses when they're going to work, that they earn more than only one person who is working, and that they have a kind of a financial support that you get at minimum, the minimum wages or a little bit more. And that leads to the situation that people get back into the labor market and can pay the contributions by themselves. So once again, I'm still on the way, and I know that also the unions in Europe are doing that. The contributory systems are the one that we want to achieve and what is the goal. And the state finance basic floor can be a way to do that. But again, without a good governance, you will never achieve that.
Okay, so good governance, if I'm going to live from this, is also a way of ensuring that we're moving from statements into actual practice. It's a way of keeping each other accountable and making sure that we're doing what we said we would do, the way that we said we would do it. I want to build this, and I want to come to Madame Karvar on exactly this point, because if we think about in June, we know that the G7 social ministers are committed to supporting universal access to social protection in the changing world of work, not only for the G7 countries, but they've committed to do this for the whole world. Now, how will these commitments actually translate policy into actual practice, and particularly when it comes to the financing of social protection?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your question, which is very pertinent indeed. The question of the effectiveness of these commitments, international commitments, which forums such as G7 or G20 can undertake. But before talking about this effectiveness, allow me to say a few words about the content of these commitments, what we have committed ourselves collectively, the 7 countries of G7, despite our diversity in our approach to social security and social protection, but also move ahead, progress, because the French presidency, the G7, had put the topic of fighting against inequalities as a focal point of the issues before the G7. Ministers of labor recognized that they could no longer today talk about access to employment or working conditions, decent working conditions, that is, for everyone, without talking about access to social protection as an instrument, a very powerful tool to reduce inequalities, with 3 challenges before us: the issue of informal sector, finally, that deprives social protection funds and contributions which should come from work, the formality, which concerns more than at least half of the active population worldwide, and some countries, up until 90% of workforce is involved, the issue of new forms of employment. The Vice Minister spoke about it. You talked about it. You've all talked about this issue, the new forms of employments as well, which challenge our whole social protection system based on wage earning, salaries, and then a major issue, which is inequality between men and women, particularly in the issue of wages, salaries. And that means, and finally, when you do not pay women as much as their contributions to work involve, you're depriving Social Security from its resources. These resources are lost, either because women have gone into the informal sector, they're not paid regularly, or else because they're not paid at the same rank as their contribution. So this is why we've chosen 2 approaches. One, G7 countries are faced with this issue of the sustainability and adaptability of their social protection, but also the assistance that we provide through development aid that we provide to other countries for development agencies, and how which we based these criteria of development aid. What is the foundation for it? And this is why we've reached a consensus, despite our diversities, and I'd like to emphasize that. They were the United States, Canada, Japan, etc., with very different social protection systems. We have found that our appeal to access to social protection on recommendation 202 of the ILO, based on that access, a broad access, the most extensive possible, to Social Security, and particularly the social protection floors everywhere throughout the world. And this recommendation 202 gives us 4 criteria, which are social protections which are adaptable to the new forms of employment, social protection systems which are very reactive, because if we delay in providing substitution income, then the population falls back into poverty. Then the social protection systems which are financially sustainable, we'll come back to that. And the issue of social protection systems open to all. Based on these 4 criteria, we have based our appeal. We have provided our support to the appeal, to the action of the initiative Social Protection, Universal Social Protection 2030, with the World Bank and the ILO. And one of the major stakes here to be able to become effective is the fact that the G7 countries take ownership of this very interesting discussion, but in my opinion, hasn't yet been concluded at this stage, between one social protection based on rights-based, and social protection based on monetary transfer from the richer countries to the poorer countries through the World Bank and development agencies. And this discussion, I think, is essential today, crucial, so that we can move towards a protection system, a social protection system, which is sustainable financially and in the long term, So it's very important for us, on the one hand, to base this effectiveness of our commitments, base it on two pillars. The first is that each and every one of the ministers of labor have gone to look into their own government to find an approach which will commit the whole government, social affairs ministers, finance ministers, education ministers, health ministers, because this is a very important question for all governments. At an international level, we have called upon international organizations, IMF, World Bank, ILO, OECD, and to work together. We've called upon them to work together so as to make this activity that they do at an international level, make it coherent, consistent. And I'm looking at David Coady's side, the strategic framework of social expenditure, which was adopted by the IMF, is a very important commitment, which invites us to go further in the seeking of an international coherence.
And I think you've thrown the baton to Mr. Coady, so I'm going to go to the IMF as well now and ask this question, because we know that earlier this year, I think it was in June, Madame Christine Lagarde was here at the ILO during the International Labour Conference, and she did make the announcement of the new strategy on social spending of the IMF. Very briefly, in a quick nutshell, what does the strategy actually entail, and why has the IMF decided that this is the strategy that the world needs?
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to point out that the reason for the strategy was not that we were not doing anything. On the contrary, the reason for the strategy was we were doing a lot more than we ever used to do. So what we've seen, what we've definitely seen in my world, is a huge increase in the engagement of our country teams in the area of social spending. And so we thought it grew very organically as part of our increased engagement around the issue of inclusive growth. So we saw the need to actually have a strategy to guide us as to how we should engage, when and how we should engage. So what does the strategy try to do? It tries to set out the scope of how we engage and what areas we engage. But as importantly, it set out the boundaries for how we engage. Now, with those boundaries come other commitments, meaning it's not an abdication of what comes afterwards. It means that we need to engage in different ways with different groups. So we talked very much in the strategy about when we should engage. Yeah. And the traditional image of the fund and the area in which we engage is very much around the word fiscal sustainability. Yeah, which is a must. Forget about it if you don't have it. You have nothing. Yeah, so we should make sure we keep that core. Yeah, that is our core job. But as we engage in social spending, as you would expect, we were brought into the world of having to address issues of spending adequacy. Think of everything we heard this morning from Professor Sachs, and we worked with him in the area of estimating the spending that was required to meet certain SDGs. So we were brought into spending adequacy and also spending efficiency. So these were areas that our staff were already being brought into, and so that's the framework in which we use in terms of when we engage and how we engage. Now, on the how as well, we take a very much a top-down approach, as you would expect from a macro fiscal institution. What do we mean by top-down? Well, the first thing we have to tell our staff is the conversation should not start with spending, the number spending, It gives the impression that spending needs to be contained. The conversation needs to start with social gaps. So we need to be very much anchored in social gaps and social gaps that need to be filled. And so then we can move to the issue of spending adequacy, how much of these gaps is due to inadequate spending. How much of these gaps is due to inefficient spending? So we're again brought into the development agenda. We're brought outside of the short-term consolidation world into a medium-term development agenda, which maps us to things like the SDGs and government's own commitments. So then one last point there is we haven't got the depth of expertise in social protection or education or health that the other institutions have. So when we say boundaries, we don't mean that we abdicate responsibility once we say, okay, here we told you about the spending. We have a duty to strengthen our engagement with our development partners. And a huge part of the strategy is about making sure we start that process now.
So, and I appreciate your response because it speaks not only to adaptability, which we've been talking about from a social protection perspective, but it's about international institutions also adapting to a changing world. And as you're saying, the scope of what the conversations are in country is getting wider and broader, and so you're beginning to see the institution responding in that regard. Now, I'm keen to get Madame Sepúlveda's voice in, but before I do, I just want to quickly come to Valérie. And Valérie, I know that there's a recently published handbook at the ILO on fiscal space, and in fact, it's going to be launched later on this week, I believe, on Thursday. Why is the ILO working on financing social protection in particular? And most importantly, what is the value add that the ILO is bringing to this conversation?
Thank you, Nosy. So first, I would like to say that the main reason why we are working on financing social protection is because we know that the coverage gap, the huge coverage gap of 55% of the world's population that has no access at all to social protection cannot be closed if we don't close the financing gap. And this is why we have also launched this study this morning that shows exactly how much, what is the size of this financing gap, so that we can then base our discussions on how to do it based on figures. To answer your second question on the ILO's added value in this discussion, I think the added value of the ILO is clear. We have a mandate that is given to us by our constituents through the adoption of international labor standards, and many of them are on social security, including the recommendation 202 that Anousheh Karvar was mentioning earlier. These standards include provisions on financing social protection. Yeah. One of them is that social protection systems should be financially sustainable. Another of them is that social protection systems should be based on risk sharing and solidarity in financing. So this is really what frames our action when we are working in countries, really trying to build social protection systems that are based on solidarity at the national level. And this morning we heard that we need to increase the domestic capacity to finance social protection through solidarity, different ways of solidarity, through tax reforms, but also through expanding social security, contributory social security to the informal economy, workers and employers. And this was mentioned also by Mr. Breuer and Mr. Eugene. And more we are talking as well, and this is also thanks to your great work, Anousheh, within the G7, and thanks to the work that we are doing with Jeffrey Sachs and that you could hear this morning about an international solidarity that will not be only to provide technical support to design the systems, this startup cost, if you want, but really to move from the millions to the billions. And this was exactly the discussion we had this morning. Last point, I think I think one of our added value at the ILO is that we are not only working in the silo of social protection, but we are working on decent work. And when we are talking about formalization of the informal economy, which is key if we really want to close the coverage gap and the financing gap, we do that with our colleagues from other departments. We are looking at employment policy, skills development, etc., so that we have really a comprehensive approach to formalization. And of course, social protection is part of this comprehensive approach. Last but not least, I would like to stress social dialogue. That is key to achieve not only financial sustainability, but also social sustainability. And I think we have this discussion with our partners as well. Thank you.
Absolutely. So definitely in social dialogue. I want to tap into the first point that you were making, this issue of solidarity, because I think it's been a recurrent theme for us over the last 2 days. And Madame Sepúlveda, I want to come to you with this, because if we think about the last 2 days, many speakers have been talking about universal social protection that should be aligned to the ILO's principles that we've been talking about, risk sharing, redistribution, and Valérie now reinforcing solidarity. But what we see in reality is, for instance, very different. The fact that we know we've just had a conversation about how multinationals are coming up with very sophisticated tax avoidance schemes. And we know that this has resulted in revenue that is lost to social protection. So the question to you is this. What are the most urgent steps in order to improve the rules for taxing multinationals that have to be taken if we're really going to see this aspiration of Agenda 2030 SDG 1.3 come to life?
Thank you for this question. It is a critical question. We need to change, and it's imperative that we change the way in which we tax multinational. The system is based on a fiction of treating the various affiliates of subsidiaries of multinationals as if they were just one entity without independent from each other. This is the arm's length principle. And this is a fiction that has facilitated multinationals to create complex system for tax avoidance. So what they do is just they choose the jurisdiction that is more convenient for them, that has a very low taxation or zero taxation, a tax haven. And this is a major issue. Just to give you an example, from 60 out of the 500 major firms in the US, for example, such as Amazon, Netflix, or General Motors, pay zero taxes whatsoever in 2018. And what is more difficult to understand for no common citizen is that this is legal. They can do this because the system allows them to do it. But these practices are not a victimless practices. Those who suffer the most for this kind of practices are the poorest and more disadvantaged people in the country and developing countries. Why the poorest? First, because if the government do not have access to resources, they cannot invest in social protection and infrastructure in public services, with a disproportionate impact on women. And second, somebody has to pay. So the burden of the taxation comes on common citizen, most commonly in the form of regressive consumption taxes, such as VAT, value-added taxes. But developing countries are also the ones that are losing here. So it's very important that we put this on the table. And why they're losing? Because developing countries relied on corporate taxation more than other countries. For Africa and Latin American countries, for example, they depend on 15% of corporate taxation, and this is only a 9% in OECD countries. But also because some estimate has showed that more than $100 billion each year are lost in money that multinational companies are putting in tax haven. And this is money that developing countries are losing, and it's way beyond or above what is in ODA, an official development assistance that countries receive. So we have to change the system, and many of the discussion this morning has talked about digitalization and the digital economy, and the digital economy is increasing all this disadvantage for developing countries and for poor people. So it is imperative that we change the system.
It's imperative that we change the system. So let me quickly test that proposition. I'm going to test it with you, Madame Karvar, very quickly. What are the next steps of the G7 to ensure that fair taxation, that there is fair taxation, and that the race to the bottom, as Professor Sachs also described it, stops?
Merci beaucoup pour...
Thank you very much for that question. It enables me to weigh up what we have done in G7 on financing. We've been working on tax evasion and tax fraud. And we do know that tax evasion and tax fraud do significantly reduce resources for social protection, as my colleagues have said. We also called for a coordinated response from G7 countries on taxation of multinationals, particularly on digital multinationals. This is why the G7 finance appeal was taken up by the OECD, which brings together the most developed countries, for a minimum taxation system be proposed in all OECD countries. And hand in hand with that, we obviously need to develop, because there's the question of the effectiveness of social spending, and that depends a lot on the tax collection system and whether it's effective or not. And so there are these schemes set up for the data exchange. They're all very powerful tools in restoring legitimacy to tax collection. Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I want us to pivot for a second, and thank you for those insights on how we might improve legitimacy and use data for tax collection. I'd like us to pivot for a second and look at another option. And this is the question that we posed to Madame Jennifer Topping, who's an executive coordinator at the United Nations Multi-Partner Trust Fund Office. We put this question to her. We said, if we were to look at increasing fiscal space by looking at or advocating for increased aid and transfers, from your perspective, what is the comparative advantage of multi-partner trust funds compared to bilateral agreements when it comes to financing social protection? And this is the answer that she shared with us. Please turn your focus to the screens.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much for this opportunity to be with you. In the exchange on the preparation for this panel, the question that was put forward to us by the organizers was, firstly, what are the advantages of multi-partner trust funds and multi-stakeholder financing approaches compared to bilateral arrangements when it comes to financing social protection? That's a great question. I'm glad you brought it forward, and it's something that we've worked on very closely with the ILO social protection team and with agencies across the UN family and beyond on this issue. 3 quick dimensions of what the key comparative advantages are of multi-partner trust funds in this space. First of all, they allow for governments to access a wide range of expertise and resources of the UN family and beyond through a single instrument and a single approach. So right off the bat, that helps with synergies, that helps with transactions and coherence in an approach to financing social protection. Secondly, the multi-stakeholder financing approaches allow for a more integrated response substantively. So not only does it allow for a wider range of actors in an efficient manner, but it allows for a substantively more integrated policy response as you're looking at different dimensions of social protection within the range of needs and services that a government might request from the UN system and beyond. Thirdly, I would say that one of the key advantages of multi-partner trust funds in this area of social protection financing is that they allow for more flexibility and therefore more innovation and risk management when it comes to financing. So when you're in a more constrained or more narrow bilateral partnership for a particular project or a particular intervention, the risk management paradigm of that financing is more specifically aligned to that program or approach. Whereas if you have a financing instrument that is more multi-stakeholder, a wider range of coverage and partnerships, that means what goes along with it is more space for innovation, more space for testing, and more space for risk management. So those are some of the key advantages and comparative advantages of multi-stakeholder trust funds in this space. They complement well other bilateral approaches. It's not only that this would be the financing arrangement. Of course, there's many forms to complement national budget resources for social protection, but they're a particularly advantageous one for those 3 reasons.
So what we're hearing is that it's not either or, but they are complementary to each other. But I do want to maybe bring in another real-life experience very quickly with you, Madame Sepúlveda, because we know that with Olivier de Schutter, you've brought up the idea of a global fund for social protection as early as 2012. So that's a good 7 years ago. Could you briefly explain to us the idea that you presented at the time? And then as you reflect on the current context today, how urgent, in your view, is the implementation of such a fund?
Thank you. Indeed, we presented a global fund for social protection in 2012. The idea was really based on the issue of solidarity of financing that we have been discussing. The proposal that it's very hard to summarize in very few minutes, that it was a very long one, but contained two branches. One, it was what we call the facility branch, that it was to help states it was a fund that could help a state to implement social protection system. And another one that we call the reinsurance branch, that it was to insurance or to provide temporary funding for states that for some crisis or some shock would have an increased number of people that need access to social protection, or that the state has been unable to provide. We made several proposals and very technical proposal on how this can be implemented, where this type of fund can be provided, and also a lot of consideration about the technical support. But this was 7 years ago, so let me leave that aside and bring what has happened, why this is critical. And I think that this is the main question that we need to solve now. I think that the world is facing a perfect storm with high levels of inequality, with a climate crisis, and with austerity measures that Isabel Ortiz has called the new normal, and that we're going to have until 2024. And it is having a devastating impact on vulnerable and disadvantaged groups, in particular women and other groups. So we need to address this. We need to take measures. We cannot, as concerned citizens, we cannot accept the excuse of states that they do not have money to implement or to invest in social protection. We need to change that paradigm. I think that we have lost the cultural battle here, and we still believe that sometime if we invest in public services and social protection, we will damage the economy. That evidence is wrong, and we need to come back with the evidence. There is no way to fight the levels of inequality that we have today, or to confront the climate crisis without solidarity in funding for developing countries and least developing countries, for increasing the mobilization of domestic resources in middle income and developed countries.
Mr. Herman, I've been dying to hear your voice. Madame Sepúlveda speaks about a perfect storm. And we know that you've been thinking and doing quite a lot of thinking work around how do we safeguard national social protection systems in times of economic crises and in times of natural disasters. Could you briefly explain to us or elaborate your idea on of a compact that's a compact for assured and sustainable financing of social protection floors in developing countries in the context of a perfect storm?
Thank you, and thanks to the ILO for inviting me, and for those who are interested, there's a paper, it's still in draft form, and you can find it on this compact, you can find it if you Google me, but Google Barry Herman New School. If you Google Barry Herman, you will find that he is a band leader in New Jersey, and he plays weddings and bar mitzvahs, and that's not me. Okay, I'm an economist, and as an economist, we work by making assumptions. And so let me assume that we have a government, country X, that in consultation with its population, through its legislature, through open debate in the press, through civil society engagement, develops a sustainable development strategy and an integrated national financing framework to implement that strategy. I'm wearing my Financing for Development button, so I'm giving them a shout out. And that as part of it, they adopt an adequate, efficient, and sustainably financed social protection floor. This is an assumption, right? But let us assume they do that. Let us also assume that individuals who receive interest income from bonds prefer not to receive that interest if it comes at the cost of people who have been devastated in a hurricane or through a drought or just through an economic crisis of one form or another, that they would rather wait and receive their income from those bonds at a later stage. Let us also assume that the people as citizens say to their governments, well, you know, you have loans to countries, and when the economic situation deteriorates or there's a crisis, we would rather you did not collect the interest at that point and delay repayments at that point, and that you would instruct the international financial institutions like the World Bank to also delay their payments. So there would be a kind of risk sharing between the ultimate beneficiaries of the loans or the bonds and the people in the countries that are doing the borrowing. Let us also assume that the International Monetary Fund keeps to its mandate, and which is helping countries have sustainable macroeconomic situations, and that it eschews some of the structural policy requirements that it has required of countries. I have in mind impediments that, policies that were required, for example, in the late 90s of Korea and of Indonesia at the request of the US Treasury, or the pressure that came from the Europeans to squeeze Greece, okay? So imagine you have that International Monetary Fund. And then imagine that there were funds you could borrow from the International Monetary Fund just by asking. I mean, you'd have to say, yes, I have a crisis, I have a balance of payments problem, and I could use some funding, and you go to the fund and you say, please, can I have some money? And it's a loan, but it's a zero-interest loan for low-income countries. Imagine that you could get it. And at the same time, you could also, if you were a high-debt country, postpone your debt servicing. So not only would you then be able to continue to finance your social protection floor as before, even though your revenues have gone down because of the economic crisis, but you would be able to expand them to meet the emergency demands. How could you get this? Imagine that you could make a compact, let's say, and you say, okay, I will adopt efficient, adequate, and sustainable social protection floor, and in consequence, the IMF would say, yes, and you can come take money as you need it, for emergencies, and you can delay payments. So that would create an incentive on governments to actually engage in this activity. Is this totally crazy? Would David Coady take food out of the mouths of babies to pay interest to Wall Street bankers? I know David a bit. Somehow I don't think so. Does the IMF actually do this kind of lending? In fact, they do. They have two rapid facilities. They're not large enough, but if a country has a decent Article 4 consultations, considered behaving in an appropriate way in terms of its macroeconomic policy, they can just go to the fund in an emergency, ask for the fund, assuming they have a balance of payments need, and get the funds. In fact, they recently increased the access limits of countries in fragile situations to be able to tap in these funds. So it's not totally ridiculous to think they could even increase it more. And finally, there are bonds that have hurricane clauses. Barbados and Grenada already have these bonds. And there are people who have interest in these things, and there are term sheets to, which are a basic sketch of how a bond contract would be written with a hurricane clause, and you can imagine for drought and for other reasons. So this is not totally impossible. It's a question of doing it. Thank you.
So let's do a quick test. So Mr. Herman says, I do not believe that this is a totally crazy idea. So thumbs up if you think he's onto a good idea. That we're not going to ask Mr. Coady to vote on this one, but let's just quickly show. Thumbs up if we think it's a good idea for countries to be able to go to the IMF and say, I need help, and I need it now. Thumbs up? So you've got about 40–50% buy-in from the room, Mr. Herman. So it's not a totally crazy idea. There are people who seem to think that this is something that should be done. So we appreciate the thinking work that you're doing. And ladies and gentlemen, the beautiful thing about moments like these is that one day we'll reflect on this day in 2019 and we'll say, once upon a time, a crazy idea was put onto the table. And by then, it won't be such a crazy idea after all. So thank you for that contribution. All right, so what I'd love to do is I've got literally 5 minutes left, but I'm going to use my superpowers and I'm going to extend it to 10 minutes because I've just got three quick questions that I've got left that I want to get through. I want to come back to Madame Carr very quickly. And Madame Carr, I want us to talk about the balance between financing social protection from national sources and balancing that with international sources, especially as we talk about sustainability and adequacy of social protection. What should this balance look like?
Thank you very much. I mean, again, I will come back to my previous intervention and reiterate that the national governments are the primary duty bearers when it comes to delivering on the right to social protection. However, we know that the world is not perfect. Mm-hmm. We don't live in ideal circumstances. So we know that there are countries in the world that need extra help. And I think from a previous panel we had very eloquently put arguments that money is actually not hasn't disappeared from the world, that there is actually plenty of money around. It's a matter of how this money is put forward and what it's used for. Yeah. So very clearly when we are talking about least developed countries or the low income countries, low middle income countries, we are talking about development aid. And the question is whether also we saw statistics that the countries, although they have made commitments, but they have not delivered on commitments. So there is another source of finance available to us. But we also have to think that when we are talking about the use of development aid, it shouldn't be just to give money and to spend for a short-term period. We need to also think in terms of institution building, developing the necessary systems in the countries so that the governments can actually be more effective in raising the revenues necessary to become self-sufficient or more self-sufficient when we are talking about providing the social protection floors. And as I said, this lack of development finance has been proved in many, many cases. But again, it applies when we are looking at extra resources or where the money could come from, it applies to developed and developing countries in the same way. So we need to also look at sort of whether the employers are paying their due contribution, whether the share between the employers and the workers is there, or whether we face situations like in the European Union, we have member states where the governments have actually reduced considerably the contributions that the employer has to pay and have put it all on the worker. Or precisely, there are initiatives in the EU where we are looking at how to actually guarantee access to everybody, regardless of the form of the contract. And also, talking about macroeconomy, there is another idea that in Europe we are in the moment of sort of renewal, political renewal. So the incoming Commission President-elect has also talked about making sure that there is a European-level macroeconomic instrument for stabilizing during the shocks for unemployment benefits, for example. So there are many, many different mechanisms, and but we cannot just kind of look at these things in silos, but we need a comprehensive, more coherent approach.
So there are many mechanisms, and I want to just quickly pick up on that point because it's by looking at one of these mechanisms that we crafted another question for Madame Topping, which she's responded for us. We lifted the Secretary General's roadmap for financing the 2030 agenda, and we've said to her that there's a lot of emphasis that has been put on innovative financing and the involvement of the private sector when you begin to engage with this roadmap. And so the question that we put to her was, to what extent does she think that there is potential in the field of social protection to see greater involvement of the private sector? And this is what she said in response.
The second question was, what is the potential and the role for the private sector financing in relation to multi-partner trust funds and social protection? And here, it's a great question again, because it's a newer area of work in the UN family in partnership with the private sector, particularly in social protection. I know there's a global business network that ILO leads. I know there's been a lot of engagement through the Global SDG Fund that my colleague Lisa Courbil will have spoken about, I think, in the previous panel. And we've seen a step up in private sector engagement through that facility. And just in this last round of call for proposals for financing through that fund on social protection, we saw 41 different private sector entities engaged in the bids from country level on that fund, and in 36 different countries across the globe. And that's a real step change in the engagement of the private sector, both in social protection and through the multi-stakeholder financing approach. So what are some of the ways that we see this coming up? Again, I would say three ways that this is playing out, the private sector engagement in social protection financing and in multi-stakeholder trust funds. Firstly is through a kind of blending approach, a mixing of private and public resources, co-financing at the country level in different areas of work on social protection. And we see that in countries ranging from Indonesia to Somalia to Mongolia. And this is a kind of a win-win because of the blending of both private and public interests. And that depends on the specific area of work in social protection where that plays out. Secondly, there's a partnership shaping up in many countries where the skills training of business in different fields of social protection, whether it be in health insurance or whether it be in employment and employment benefits and training and skills training, that there's really a win-win with business and governments and the UN family in strengthening the partnership of private and public actors in the social protection schemes. Thirdly, there's a really new and interesting area of work emerging in social protection in the private sector partnership domain, and that is the role of the private sector in risk management, in particular when it comes to climate resilience and protection schemes from shocks in climate and disaster risk reduction high-risk countries. So this we're seeing as a new and emerging area of partnership on the ground, and certainly given the agenda that we are seeing worldwide with a higher risk for climate and climate-related natural disasters and therefore the protection schemes associated with them. It's something we would like to help promote through the joint fund and through other financing mechanisms much more in the future. Thank you. I hope that covers the main response to the questions you've asked, and good luck with the rest of the panel. Thank you again for the opportunity.
So from Madame Jennifer Topping to the final two questions, we have to bring in Mr. Coady back into the conversation. We've tested whether he's going to be giving us more money in different ways. So at the very least, we allow him to speak one last time before we wrap. And the question is this: what are your perspectives on how the IMF and the ILO can work together in the field of extending fiscal space for social protection?
Thank you very much. I think a prerequisite for a lot of this to happen is that the collaboration, coordination, even before collaboration between different groups, different development partners, needs to work better. So, for example, in this context, I described what I thought the IMF, the strategy says we do, but clearly you don't look to the IMF to design a social protection system or an education system or a health system. You look for us to keep these issues on the agenda very prominently, give them their rightful place on the agenda, not something that's an afterthought, but you also expect us to be part of finding the financing for that. So we have a very important role to play, but we're not the experts. So getting our act together as development partners is really important. So here I'd give a call out for SPIAC-B. And when I say that at the fund, they say, what is that? It's the Social Protection Interagency Collaboration Board. I think that's the first time I've remembered it in full. But it's a very important place, and we need to make sure we continue to make that work. But the question that was put to me initially was, how can the ILO and IMF work together in this field? One of the key things, and without this, nothing is going to happen. It's really important that our engagement moves to the field. This has to happen in countries. It has to happen in countries if we're to effectively understand the challenges that countries face. And this brings me to my third point, and this is really crucial, this has to be based on country ownership. It will not be based on country ownership if we develop our paradigms independently of governments. Governments have to take ownership for this. The best laid plans will go nowhere unless governments take ownership. And that will also ensure that the strategy, the social protection strategy in this case, will actually reflect country preferences, which do differ. This is the domain of politics, the domain of public policy in countries. So it's really important that we go to the country level. Now, in that sense, what really has to happen at the country level, and the absence of this has often always surprised me, is we need two things. We need a whole-of-government approach. What does that mean? These are wonderful terms, but I think they mean something very important. It means that the biggest champions for increasing a value-added tax or increasing income tax or getting rid of energy subsidies should be in government the line ministries, the spending ministries, not the Ministry of Finance. And yet we see again and again rolling out of, we're going to increase energy prices, we're going to increase the VAT, and we're surprised that people go to the street. This is like a reality check for us. The other one is we also need a whole-of-society approach. The conversation has to start not with we need to increase taxes, it has to start with there are big social gaps, and we need to fill these gaps. And for that social contract to be developed, the government has to have credibility. So the government needs a credible, in this case, social protection strategy. But also remember, one of the reasons it has to go to countries because they face the reality. They don't just think about social protection by itself. They have to think about education and health, as Jeffrey Sachs said earlier today. The governments have many things they want to finance, and these things are often complementary. social protection should not be discussed independent of health and education.
Yeah.
So the discipline of the country will force us down there. I think to develop that contract, the social contract, governments need to have a comprehensive and credible development strategy, and also it needs to be transparent and accountable. The people that are going to the streets, either because of a WhatsApp tax or because of an energy subsidy increase, are not going there because they don't care about the fact that we need to efficiently tax fossil fuels. They're going there because they don't think it's credible they will benefit from the revenues that are there. So the challenge of the SDGs is huge. We will get nowhere near it unless we work on that social contract. That has to be led from the countries, but the development partners need to be ready to support the countries in developing their own social contract.
Sure. So lots been said in that final contribution, and thank you very much. And a lot of this will be pulled into the consolidated summary notes. The final question is, as the chair of this session, Valérie, you've been listening intensely. I've watched you take copious notes as everybody was speaking. And so the question is, how does the ILO now concretely increase the work that it does around the financing of SDG 1.3?
Thank you. I think we have heard many speakers explaining that the solution starts at the national level by increasing domestic resources for social protection. This is not a new area of work of the ILO, but we would like, as David mentioned, to do it through more collaboration with other members of the SPIAC-B, including the IMF in some countries where it can be possible. This includes increasing the fiscal space for social protection. And for us, one of the, and you have mentioned the guide that will be launched tomorrow on fiscal space that was actually co-authored by Isabel Ortiz, our previous director, and a number of people of our team. One of the areas where we think we have a real added value in these discussions is to ensure that the decisions made in terms of financing social protection really are aligned with ILO's core values and principles, including solidarity. And of course here, I think we will accelerate our work on expanding coverage to the informal economy through contributory social security and work also closely with ISA on this, as we know that this is a way to actually increase resources for social protection and contribute at the same time to the formalization of workers and enterprises. But the discussion that started actually earlier this morning with the previous panel and continued in this panel is also about how do we mobilize more the international solidarity, not only to finance development cooperation projects of a few millions, but here to go to the billions. And this, I mean, we have many ideas around the table. We have also very concrete initiatives with the G7. And I think we need to move forward all together. And this is not the appanage of the ILO. We will have to work all together to achieve something here. Thank you.
Valérie, thank you very much. So ladies and gentlemen, from a high level, that if I were just to pick up some of the sound bites that have been reflective of this conversation, we need to think in terms of through the lens of whole government and whole society. We cannot relegate national ownership. We need to tap into national solidarity as well as international solidarity. We need to keep the core or the DNA of the Y intact: solidarity, universality, adaptability, sustainability. We need to be bold about extending social protection into to cover those that find themselves in the informal sector and also in new ways of working that are coming up with the future world of work. We need to not forget about multi-party funding strategies and opening up opportunities there. We cannot turn a blind eye to tax reforms because we need to have that conversation, as difficult as it might be. And last but not least, none of this is going to be achieved in the next 9.5 years unless we're willing to walk together. May I please give a big round of applause to my panelists. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, just a few quick announcements. I'm going to ask my panelists to stay because I know that the photographer is standing by to get a picture. We're going to break for lunch now. Just as yesterday, the lunch is in the cafeteria at 2 p.m. So lunch is going to run now from 12:15 to 2 p.m. At 2 p.m., 1400 hours, we're going to be starting a very, very special session. It is the commitment session. You do not want to miss this session, so please be back in the room by 2 p.m. And remember that during lunch, we are still encouraging you to have your bilateral engagements, go and engage with the exhibitions, go and engage with the digital maps, and of course, please enjoy lunch. So I'll see you at 2 p.m. Thank you so much.